Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Simon Maxwell. Thank you all very much for coming to this CDKN and ODI event. I'm sitting down because we're being live streamed around the world, and that means we're on the record. So remember that before you say anything too controversial, but don't let it stop you. And of course, the people outside the room, welcome also, and your contributions will be very welcome and will come to me, I hope, via an iPad so that I can feed them into the conversation. And thank you also, all of you, for taking time out from, I'm sure, all the campaigning you're doing for the election next week. For any party or all parties. And it's interesting that we should be in the middle of a general election in the UK, actually, because this issue of harnessing private enterprise for the purposes of wider social good is very much on the agenda of all the parties, probably generally, but certainly in terms of their development manifestos. And it's worth reading those because we know that, for example, both the Conservative and Labour parties have made a big play on the private sector contribution to international development, perhaps with a slightly different focus, which would be worth exploring. But this is a topic that is really very much discussed in the UK and in the development community. How can we go beyond simply encouraging foreign direct investment to making sure that foreign direct investment and indeed domestic investment contributes to jobs, contributes to the environment, contributes to resilience, and in general is consistent with sustainable development goals. In CDKN, we care a lot about poverty reduction and we care a lot about sustainable development, but we focus particularly on something we call climate compatible development, which is delivering action on climate change in a way that is not going to undermine development prospects. And we're especially interested in the way in which the private sector can make a contribution to that. And we're going to hear something about the contribution of the private sector and our work with the private sector in a few minutes. We have till 2:30. We're going to start by hearing from Pippa Halings, who is the CDKN outcome lead for climate compatible development policy and practice, and was formerly our leader also in Latin America. She's sitting on the left. Jonathan Treacher, who's executive chairman of Africa Power and of the ARDO Capital investment banking firm focused on renewable energy and clean tech, who will talk about some of their work, including in Uganda. Pedro Tarak, who's been a pioneer in the field of developing ways in which development, sustainable development, environmental protection and sustainability can be brought together with the private sector, and helped to set up Sistema B, and is co-founder and chairman of the board, and a board member and shareholder of a project he's going to talk about called Guayaquil B Corp. And then Juan Pablo Larena, who's co-founder and executive director of Sistema B International, but is also co-founder of LATE, and is going to talk about redefining success in the markets and the economy, the case of Sistema B. If we can all be disciplined, I'm talking to you, boys and girls on the panel, we will have a good 45 minutes for discussion and debate before we come to a conclusion at about 2:30. And I hope we can actually solve this question of whether we've got models which we can roll out and scale up, which will deliver the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, and social and environmental. Pippa, if we may, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I think we are all very aware of the scale of the problem that we're addressing, which is around climate. And as Simon said, CDKN has been focusing now, it's in its 6th year, looking at ways it can support decision makers to address the climate challenge without undermining the development imperatives. And I think we could say that as we're looking at the issue of private sector and how we bring private sector into this, perhaps we take it back and say climate change is probably the defining global public good, because there is no one individual organisation or government that has been responsible for climate change, and there is no one particular one that can actually solve the issue. And anybody who takes an action now will not necessarily receive the full benefits of that action And some will suffer the consequences of that without having taken that action, and some will reap benefits from that. So it's this issue of the global public good. So whose responsibility is it to address this and tackle this issue? And Christine Lagarde said, for her, this was the greatest economic challenge of the century beyond public debt. That this is what we have to be addressing. We have to look at the economics of it. And the conventional approach that we know is through the international negotiation, so in between governments, looking at trying to reach a global agreement for the first time ever between all countries on what we'll do, and for national government action as well. And we said it's 100 billion minimum is what we need to address this. And to get some confidence for people to work together on this, by Lima, we'd managed to reach 10 between governments and multilaterals. 10 billion out of the minimum 100 billion we need. And again, in our development, multilateral people that are working on these issues, what was our answer to the 90 billion gap? The private sector. So it will be the private sector who will bring in that 90 billion. So everyone runs around saying, so how do we incentivize the private sector to come in and provide that finance, that gap, that missing piece? And a lot of work has been done on this, especially in this government, in terms of, there's a private sector development whole approach by DFID with this government, an analysis of how that's been working. There's the donor committee on enterprise development as well, looking at these issues. ODI has done its own business for poverty initiative. So there's a lot of work, and CDKN in this, very humbly, was saying, our little piece that we want to do is say, within CDKN, how can we address it? And we brought together the Aldersgate Group, which is a group of leaders in business, politics and society to look at what is the role of private sector in this, and perhaps what's the role of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance. Should aid money be providing funds for private sector initiatives? And the whole issue of additionality, shouldn't they be paying for it themselves anyway? If it's for profitability, what role does aid funding play in this? And we all know the debate going on at the moment about privatising basic services and, the sort of the associations of private sector and privatising and development imperatives. But what we found was it was very rare to see within the climate field business-to-business initiatives that had used aid funding that didn't substitute what private sector would have put in there anyway, and helped to address some of the barriers to why private sector perhaps weren't moving in this field. And they were around cooperation initiatives, knowledge sharing, innovation around technology or understanding best practice from one place to another, creating a community and enabling that community to happen, bring on board policymakers around barriers or risks to capital investment, and then the issue of scale. How do you get some of these pilot actions to scale? So CDKN decided to throw out a different way of using aid funding, which was a challenge fund, and invited initiatives that were business to business, and said, provide us with a project proposal that would say how you would use a certain amount of funding from CDKN to show on the ground how businesses working together with a little small piece of funding from aid funding, DFID government funding and Dutch funding, could actually provide evidence of why this is important and how it could get to scale. So the 4 projects that we have I got my presentation up there at all? Yeah. Do I go to this one? So one of them is in Peru, and it's working with Carbon Trust and Peru 2021, which is a group of sort of very forward-looking CEOs who've made them money and now looking to do something different and transformational in Peru, Peruvians and others, where how you can actually accelerate development into energy and efficiency of corporations. And after 2 years, we're now linking that up with the Peruvian government process for their pledges on emissions reductions to the INDCs of how these corporations can be part and help the governments to do that. That's the one in Peru. In Ethiopia and Kenya, so renewable energies or alternative forms of low-carbon energy, geothermal. The potential is huge in Kenya and Ethiopia. The demand is there, But for years, this has just not really gone anywhere because of the risk to capital investment at the beginning, because it's so hard to get to the technology to really get to start this up. So this is about how do you provide support to look at innovative financial mechanisms for risk insurance. So it's working with the risk insurance market around a new renewable energy alternative. And in India, it's about how you get off-grid renewable energy access to more than 90% of the population who are off-grid, haven't got access to electricity, through a franchising approach, a profitable franchising approach to do that. Again, it's about this accelerating, it's about creating a community around that and getting to scale. And then the final one is in Uganda, and I would leave Jonathan to talk to the final one. These are four, but we're also interested in cooperation. What does cooperation between business and aid and donor organisations like CDKN and government decision makers is our interest. And Sistema B, we have Juan Pablo and Pedro here, are one that we're interested in South America, about how you actually start to redefine profitability in the markets as well for common objectives. And we think that probably to get to that 90 billion gap and beyond, we're probably talking the wrong language, which is something we've been talking about this morning. So that's something we'll be very interested in engaging in today. Thank you.
I love this idea that people first make their money and then they think about how they can be socially useful. Maybe we should reverse that. Be socially useful and then worry about making money afterwards, or perhaps put the two together. And Jonathan, you might help us in that direction.
Absolutely. As has been the introduction, I'm Jonathan Treacher. I'm the Executive Chairman of Africa Power. I very much have a finance background. I don't come from development or anything else. In fact, I've got a background in CEO of a hedge fund and running corporate finance businesses. But I've been very active in Uganda for 12 years, and I very much subscribe to this view about what do we need to do to bring in private capital. That's the only way anything is really going to develop, and we have to create those right conditions for that money to flow. And just by way of background, I mean, I believe money is almost like water. It will find its own way, but you've got to make that condition so it can run downhill. We're doing, through our company Africa Power, this project which has been mentioned in Uganda. Okay, so we are pursuing what we call the ABCD model, which is to provide electricity to rural areas. A stands for an anchor tenant. So we need some credit-worthy entity to buy power from us to underpin the whole thing. In our case, that is cell phone tower companies. So we are putting solar panels on off-grid cell phone towers and replacing expensive diesel. Second is the B, that is business. There's no point in putting electricity into a village or anywhere else if people can't use that electricity to do something, and to do something profitable, to create their own little business, to create a phone charging business, to I don't know what, but that's the point of the electricity. C stands for community, i.e. putting electricity in a school or a health center or something like that. And D is obviously domestic, which stands for putting electricity into homes where they can study at night, get off their addiction to kerosene and other things. So we believe in looking at a holistic model, if you will, of putting electricity into a rural setting where it can be profitable and people are prepared to pay for that, the anchor tenant and the others. There's an issue around whether the community pays for that or whether that's a sort of gifted add-on, but the key is you've got to make it so that people value the electricity they're being given and find a way to pay for it. As has been mentioned, funding for this came from CDKN. I think we're learning an awful lot through this project, and without that funding, we wouldn't have even got off the ground. We wouldn't have had credibility with cell phone tower operators, villagers, regulators, and others. So I think the funding was incredibly important in order to get everything moving. As I said, our strategy is trying to build an independent power production company. And from a finance point of view, you're basically trying to build an off-grid utility. So we are interested in selling power to places where the grid doesn't reach. Now, in Uganda, the grid doesn't reach 80 to 85% of the country, and even those parts of the country where it does work, does reach, it isn't very responsive and all the rest of it. So there's a huge market out there in terms of need. And the grid is never, ever, ever going to reach that. And why should it? It's very, very expensive to extend the grid out to rural communities. It costs a lot of money. It's very difficult. It's political. And there's no need to. Technology has really moved forward. So why in a country would you put in phone boxes and landlines when mobiles are there? It's the same with solar. The cost of panels have fallen dramatically. It's the same with the technology in terms of battery storage, in terms of remote monitoring, control systems, micropayments. All of those things are enabling you to go out into remote areas or more remote areas and deliver a service without a huge infrastructure cost. And maybe it works in village A, but it doesn't work for a couple of years in village B. But you're not expensively coming out and building a grid or even a mini grid, which seems to be the flavor of the month. So the capital expenditure can be much less. It's replicable, but you have to pick your right villages and your right places. The issue for us, and this is what we are trying to ascertain, is where is the economics in this? How much are people prepared to pay for the electricity? How much are they prepared to pay to have electricity in their business? Can they create profitable businesses in their village if they've provided with electricity at a certain price? Is there an opportunity, for example, for them to create micro businesses? And also, will consumers trade up? The ideal is that you sell them a solar panel and a light in their house. A couple of years later or a year later, they've paid that off. They buy a TV or they'll need another solar panel. You're constantly trading them up in the cycle, which is what's building the business. That's not proven yet, and we're starting slowly on our journey. But to date, we've got solar on our first cell phone tower, and in the first months of operation, it's absolutely used no diesel whatsoever. So hugely, one of our clients, 365 cell phone towers, all burning very, very expensive diesel, costing them maybe $150,000 to $200,000 a year per cell phone tower in depreciation and diesel costs, not to mention theft of diesel, driving up and down, refilling it and everything else. By putting solar and deep cycle batteries, you still have a generator, but you don't need to turn it on. And so, I mean, there's a huge amount of carbon reduction. There's you're not traveling around delivering diesel. The whole thing will be turned on its head. Now, that works in Uganda. You position the solar right. I don't think it's going to be on every tower where there will be the need for some diesel, but it's dramatically reduced. It's like 70%, 80%. Now, that's a huge savings in fuel and everything else. And the that's been driven by the ability to remotely monitor how it's working, the falling costs of solar panels, and the awakening, I think, of the cell phone tower operators to realize that they are not in the business of running power. They're in the business of selling space on their towers. And a lot of these towers have now moved into ownership by private equity firms who are interested in financial return and not handling the power. So they pass it over to us. That's the anchor tenant in our model. That's very, very important because that's a big source of revenue from the cell phone tower operators. They're creditworthy customers. They need it up and running 100% of the time, and they pay. So that underpins the business model. In the villages, as I said, we're trying to do a business case as well. Now, what we've settled on is to try and do some drip feed irrigation. In Uganda, the farmland is incredibly productive, but the rainfall is massive, but it doesn't always fall in the right places at the right time. So if you could actually control the rainfall, and I think a recent study has showed that investment in agriculture has been held back solely due to water issues. So if you can actually pump the water and make sure that you get it there all the time, you could get 3 crops a year, maybe even 4. Well, that massively increases productivity. It massively increases the cash flow of all the farmers who then can get paid every 4 months or every 3 months rather than once a year or twice a year. We think it will be very transformational. Again, a solar panel, a pump, and some irrigation equipment into a field. Not hugely expensive. We're going to see how that works. Somebody said to me, well, the biggest risk is once we start producing more crops, people are going to come and steal our crops. We're going to have to spend more money on security to prevent people stealing our crops. Well, let's see. I mean, but that's a byproduct of producing more things. So we think there's an economic model where he will be willing to pay for that power, to pay for that solar irrigation, because he's getting higher yields and he's getting more crops every year. How am I doing?
I'm not tracking
okay,
the time.
okay.
Really close. Couple of
Okay,
minutes.
give me a couple more minutes then. We are technologically agnostic, so we don't make anything. We don't care about panels or anything. It just has to work. Everything will be involving. We have partners, Synchro SiteWatch on the diesel side, CPS, who did our panels, Bolton, which is a company in agriculture. We've got 4 or 5 home solar system providers. Just creating a whole infrastructure, but multiple partners, multiple people. So we're trying out many different technologies, many different suppliers. And our test is basically to see whether we can make the economic model work. We're sure we can do it technologically. We're sure we can get it executed. We can sure we can get it in the ground. The issue is, are these people willing to pay for it in enough money to make a viable economic case that makes sense for people to roll it out? If they will, that's fine. If they won't, then it hasn't worked. But I think we were discussing earlier, with the advent of mobile phones, everybody thought nobody would afford a mobile phone. But yet in Uganda, there's a huge proportion of the people that all have smartphones now and all find a way to pay for it. So if it's important to them and it impacts in their life in a positive way, I think they'll find a way to pay for it. But it's unproven in the case of electricity. I think I talked a bit about the carbon reduction in terms of the diesel, and clearly, if you can roll that out across a whole country and 4,000 cell phone towers, you're making a huge impact in terms of diesel and all the rest of it. And just one quick word on government and government intervention. I think for any of these projects to work, you need support at the local level. What you don't need is any interference or even seeing anybody from the national level. What do they care that I'm putting off-grid electricity in some village that they are never, ever, ever going to put the grid into? But they will sniff around and want to see a report and want to see this and want to see that. My view is they just want to bribe rather than actually doing anything properly. But there's no need for that. They're never going to do it. So they should just concede this to the private sector to go out and do this. And I think, one of the enabling factors is people to get off your back and not trying to be involved in it. It's economic case. If it's made, people will invest. Anyway, let me leave it there, and anybody can come up with questions after we're done.
The thing that I always find myself thinking about when I listen to presentations like this is, what's the market failure that needs government money in order to get something going? I mean, Apple use lots of government-funded technology. They don't come to us and say, well, we'd like to do a watch, so will you please fund it?
Yeah.
And it's kind of slightly paradoxical to say, we absolutely want the government off our back at the end of your presentation, but by the way, please, can we have the money? Just explain that to me.
Well, I would think the difference is very much that you've got to prove something work, and there's always a catch-22, and everybody will turn around and say, well, I'd love to invest in this, but prove to me that it's worked. Now, we could have taken our own private decision to go and spend the money ourselves.
Yes.
But since it is a small company run by the founders, were we all going to reach into our pockets and get it kick-started? Well, no. We could have, but we didn't. Now, we're not being crowded out, but it is a question of working also with somebody who has some credibility. Because if we just went out and did it on our own and said, okay, we're a small company, we've just started this, nobody takes you as seriously as you say, well, we've had a project, it's funded, you're getting publicity, all these sorts of things we're getting today. So I think there's the knowledge that we're getting, and at the end of the day, it may not work. I mean, this is risk capital in the sense that it could turn around that nobody in this village wants electricity unless it's free. They could steal all the equipment and go sell it somewhere else. There's an awful lot of risks involved in it. We'd like to see it succeed. And I've always felt there could be some kind of model where the risk is much like a angel investor provides initial risk capital. That capital gets a return for the people that put it up when the project succeeds. So if it doesn't succeed and it's all a waste of time, you write it off. but it does succeed, they either get their money back or they get some small equity carry in the project, so that when it succeeds, they have a continuing interest.
I think it's in your contract.
Yeah,
Jonathan,
so that sort of thing where you've actually got you've got that continuing relationship, and you're actually paying something back rather than just sort of taking it.
I'm pushing you because I think
No,
this
please,
is a topic we want to
to-
discuss later. But actually, DFID is doing a lot of returnable capital projects, where precisely if projects work, there is a return. I'd love to know whether CDKN has a share in this business, but we'll come back to that.
It's a small thing.
Is it? Pedro, Guayaquil, and
Okay.
more generally.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I'm from Argentina. I'm passionate, and perhaps you have to control the time, right? So help
Well,
me.
in that case, it's half past
And I
12.
would be walking around, but obviously I won't because of the stream. Well, we have a problem, and B Corps are solutions. What's the problem behind Guayaquil? The reduction of biodiversity and life-supporting systems. The South Atlantic forest, Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, I think it's only 7.8% which is standing. And this happened in, if you could, I don't know who's doing it.
You can do it yourself.
Yeah,
Look, are you?
well,
I think you can.
No. Okay.
yeah, why don't you show the map? There you see what's left. It's almost gone. So we're guys that we want to see it back. How do we do it? We trust that by creating a community of consumers, of companies, of suppliers, and talents, and investors, all together by internalizing the cost of regeneration, ecosystem regeneration, and social resilience together into our products, then we'll make it. And we'll be able to benchmark in the industry and in other industries the market notion of life regenerating business. So Guayaquil is a B Corp. And by describing Guayaquil, I will try to portray the 4 features of any B Corp. Our mission is to steward and restore 60,000 hectares and 1,000 living wages for small producers and indigenous communities in the 3 countries. That's our mission. But you know where the mission is? It's in the mission statement of our document of incorporation. So that's the first element of any B Corp. The second element of a B Corp is that we can be wonderful with our purpose and all the profits, its purpose for profit. We can be beautiful in that respect. But you know what? We might not be so good in our relations with the collaborators, the workers, or might not be so good with the shareholders, or not so good with all the, I would say in, I don't know, the other communities, all of the other stakeholders. So we're subject to a third-party, independent, international scrutiny, if you want, and an evaluation system with a metric on our overall sustainability of the company, not necessarily of the products and processes. So it's a 360-degree evaluation. If we do obtain 80 points out of 200, then we're invited to become a B Corp certified company and belong to an international community of B Corps. Now, you have all those questions that we have in workshops and coffee shops. Hey, look at the gap. Oxfam's report this year at World Economic Forum. 1% of the world population owning more than 50% of the world wealth. Now, it might not be true, it might be true. Who cares about the details about that? It's even unsustainable to live together if it were 8% of the wealth. So we ask those questions in the evaluation tool, the B impact assessment tool. What's your gap back home? What about gender issues? We all know about the need to really have a world which is even, women and men. Well, we ask the questions, not only about the people who are in your board, but what about your procurement policies? Who are you buying from? Are you buying from companies that are owned by women, more than 50% of those shares? We ask all those questions in all the dimensions. And once you become part of the B Corp community and you're certified, you actually sign the Declaration of Interdependence, not any longer the Declaration of Independence. The interdependence with all the stakeholders. And you sign it, and you actually accept recertifying yourself every 2 years because you admit that you're not perfect, that you need to improve all the time, that you have an improvement plan for the next 2 years in the areas where you're not yet very well developed. But then you also accept random audits. You make public all your punctuation, so anybody in the world can initiate a research, an investigation committee, if any of that information is false. If you look at Natura's, the cosmetic Natura's report on, because they're a publicly listed company, they had to make it public, they had to actually show all the fines that they paid, their environmental fines. Now, I'm really proud to say that it's a South American company that says, here we are, this is the way we are, and we're improving. And we've done this wrong, but we're committed to do it better. And that's the kind of business that we're talking about. But there's a third element which is crucial in a B Corp. We actually, through an amendment to our bylaws and to our, either through a shareholder agreement, we actually expand the fiduciary liability clause. You know that clause that we designed more or less 300 years ago in this part of the world? You know, prioritizing the taking care of the shareholders above all other dimensions? Well, what we do, we actually expand that to all the stakeholders. What we achieve by the expansion of the fiduciary liability clause is to incorporate the long-term and the diversity variables of all the stakeholders, the environment, the community, all the value chain, and it enables the board and the executive of a company to balance all the dimensions. So you're not forced to only prioritize the shareholder value, but you're able to combine it. So that's the third element. And the fourth element is that you belong to a community. So say the case of any B Corp, that you start procuring from other B Corps. So you start combining your impact. By the way, Guayaquil, just because of its model, enabling consumers. Did you see our products? Did you show the products? You see, what we do, we basically procure yerba mate, right? That's the southern drink, from the indigenous communities and the small producers. And then we export all of this to the US and we process it, and it becomes into 21 different products. Very few in the US still buy the yerba mate, but then it's converted into 21 different products, which are competing with Red Bull, Monster, I mean, the energizers, energy drinks. Now, just one example of how it links to CDKN. Could you put the other one? We pay from 4 to 6 times more the value of yerba mate to the producers, that they produce it in their own land. As long as they plant the yerba mate, which is a pioneer tree, and once you plant that tree, it helps all the other pollinizers and all the other species to come back, you see? So we pay from 4 to 6 times more from all our competitors. But then, half a kilo yerba mate means 573 grams of net positive carbon impact. So that's not mitigating. That's being part of the solution. And it means that every single time a consumer is buying our goods, at the same time they're satisfying a need, and at the same time they're being part of the solution. That's why we are not saying we are the solution as a company. What we do as a B Corp, we enable consumers, investors, suppliers, talents, all together be complices of a solution that we all need together. So that's the notion of a B Corp. And, well, so there you see the combination of a contribution to a climate problem and also to equity problem at the same time. The notion is not make money here and put your money into a nature reserve or create, in a separate way, but put all the economic dynamics into the solution. So when you start, a novelty that we got today is that we started finding that there were many companies like this in South America, in the real estate sector, in the cocoa sector, in chocolate sector, in coffee, in forestry, in beverages. So we actually gathered all the CEOs and owners of these companies that we know to share how each of them had exactly the same purpose, regeneration, their core business purpose. But they use the possibilities of the activity, the industrial activity, and profit. Profit is extremely important for us because it's a tool to achieve the goals and it's a tool to assess our progress. So it's an indicator for progress at the same time. So now everybody started feeling, hey, perhaps we create a new economic sector apart from our own traditional, conventional sectors, you see, but a new economic sector driven by the purpose. So basically, I would say that these are the consequences, if you want. How do you call them in the development language? The co-benefits, right? Well, we call it, creating value, integrated value. Now, I'm Pedro. One thing I need to say, I'm Pedro just like any other human being, right? And I want to live life 24 hours a day in an integrated manner. I just don't want to have this thing about here I am doing money and I go into business, here I am doing good, I go to NGOs, and if it doesn't work, we still have the governments. I don't want to live this way. I want to live all my life 24 hours a day integrating my own human DNA, which is at the same time individual. I'm part of a community, I'm part of a herd, just like any other mammal, and I'm part of the planet at the same time. So I need new ways of getting organized, different from the Industrial Revolution. We need a new way of getting structured in business, in law, and in the markets. So that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess Juan Pablo may well pick up some of these details of design. I'd love to know a bit more about where to find the certification standards, which presumably are crucial, and see how they differ from other people's. And I'd like to understand a bit more about fiduciary liability and what its statutory weight is in the discussion. But maybe, Juan Pablo, you'll pick up some of those in your presentation.
Perfect. So, hi, everyone. So, Pedro was talking mainly about B Corps, right? So this new class of business that gets together these four elements: purpose, standards, legal commitments, and being part of an international community. So about certification, businesses every 2 years have to recertify, and this is a certification of a business and not of a specific element, right? So certified B Corps are companies that are being analyzed in all their dimensions: labor practices, environmental practices, governance, transparency, and mainly the impact business model. We have at this moment more than almost 1,300 B Corps in 41 countries in the world. The community in South America, it's 173 businesses. businesses from $3.6 billion in revenues to $20,000 in revenues, businesses from more than 100 industries, businesses from 2 workers to 7,000 workers. And the key element of those businesses, as Pedro said, is that all of them commit to improve, specifically in the areas that they have a lot of improvement opportunities. But it's not only a declaration of goodwill, it's a legal commitment from shareholders that they enforce to their directors and executives, and also they protect them in order to maximize not only shareholder value but stakeholder value.
Just explain that, a legal commitment.
It's a legal commitment, so you have 2 ways of enforcing that commitment. First way, it's in countries where you don't have legislation of B Corps, which is a new corporate body that they're as incorporated as benefit corporations in 30 states of the United States, and in South America, we're trying to pass this corporate legislation in the countries where Sistema B is located, which is Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Ecuador, and Uruguay. In those countries that you don't have legislation about benefit corporations, any type of company, LLCs, corporations, co-ops, and so on, in order to be a B Corp, they have to incorporate in their bylaws 3 elements as an addendum of their bylaws. First element is that they declare that they have a purpose, which goes beyond maximizing shareholder value. Second element is that directors and executives are protected and enforced to maximize that purpose. So they have the authority within the company to, as a main, let's say, success indicator to maximize that purpose. And thirdly, that companies have to report both positive and negative impacts that they generate, and the certification is the tool that allows businesses to transparently show what are the main impacts. So in some countries, let's talk specifically about Argentina and Chile, there are big legislation gaps because in those countries, for the case of corporations, doing the amendment, the change of the bylaws is not enough in order to secure purpose on the business. So in those contexts, you need a legislation because there are still gray areas where for potential legal conflicts between shareholders, the Court of Justice could be in favor of the shareholder who is for maximizing profits. So that's why you need legislation in some of their contexts. And moving a bit forward to my presentation, I have like 2 minutes left, but I'll be fast. So in order to make a change in the economy, in the markets, and not only to redefine success in businesses, but to redefine success in markets and economy, B Corps are quite fundamental. We believe that B Corps are a new player in markets that can specifically bring light to new entrepreneurs and to businesses that come from like sustainable business sector. We have 70% of B Corps that describe themselves as social enterprises, and the other 30% of B Corps, of the B Corp community, describe themselves as sustainable businesses that were moving from CSR, traditional CSR, to share value. But it's not enough. I mean, B Corps are really necessary, but it's not enough. In order to make a change in the economy and the markets, we need other actors to play a role. Policymakers, academics, opinion leaders, and so on. So at Sistema B, we have a model where we promote this interdependence that Pedro was talking about with those economic actors, market actors, B Corps, investors, policymakers, academics, lawyers, opinion leaders, and so on, where we have this ecosystemic approach where these players build communities of practice, And those communities of practice start to be like a collective action plan where they engage within those groups, but also between those groups. So what Sistema B does is a lot about methodology. So we are quite, let's say, inspired by different methodologies that talk about how we can build new systems of influence through getting together critical connections of people from different sectors. And those critical connections, when they find a common denominator, they become communities of practice, and those communities of practice start influencing different economic sectors. So this is a new paradigm that moves from critical mass to critical connections. That basically it says, even though critical mass is important, the important thing is how you can engage the key economic players, which could be in some context 2, in other contexts thousands, but those are the ones who will mobilize more structurally the change. So how we can move from a B Corp community that is trying to change the paradigm of business and to evolve capitalism through a more ecosystemic paradigm where not only B Corps, but academics, politicians, investors, and so on, engage in this change in the economy. So, for instance, we have some examples of how we are trying to redefine success in a specific sector. So, in the case of the academia, we built a network of more than 80 academics within Latin America, and we created this initiative, Evidence for Incidence, where basically we're trying to show through case studies and through collective impact metrics what's the real impact of B Corps. So now we have to move from a nice narrative of what do B Corps do to a narrative of what are the impacts of B Corps, what are the benefits or the collective benefits that B Corps are generating. So at this moment, we have this network of academics where they are not only researching about the impact of B Corps, but in many business schools and law schools, they're starting to teach about it. So I studied economics 15 years ago, and I would have loved to learn about this way of doing business. And now, so you have at not only undergrad, but postgraduate schools as well, professors teaching deeply about this, all this framework. Then another experience is how we are trying to redefine success with policymakers. So collectively, Sistema B got together with more than 80 organizations within the region. And given that our institutional context in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, were not focused on changing or promoting a different way of doing business, but the institutions were more connected at this moment to tax reforms, educational reforms, constitutional reforms. We said, let's show not only problems, but also solutions on how we can generate new actors in market to solve social and environmental problems. So we created an initiative to influence public policies. We got together 80 organizations, and we built a crowdsourcing platform to understand what are the main barriers of these types of businesses. So we work together from conscious capitalism to the cooperative movement, CSR networks, social enterprise networks, social economy networks, think tanks, different universities. And it was quite impressive to get together so many universities because, at least in South America, it's difficult to get together universities to work together. So we built this platform, and that allowed us, that's people from the group of 101 Solutions, and that allowed us to become an actor to interact with the government in order to start designing public policies and regulatory frameworks for the benefit of these businesses. And not connected to tax reforms and so on, but just connected to give them certainty to operate under the principles of B Corps, and on the other hand, how you could have some public policies, some more carrots, let's say. Okay? And finally, this is not only about engaging leaders of the academia or of policymakers, and also it's about having a systemic change through regular citizens. So with other huge group of organizations as Sistema B, we organized a fun festival of 70,000 people on the streets where we connected musicians and entrepreneurs from social enterprises, B Corps, social entrepreneurs from global NGOs and so on, to show society that the real rock stars are not only the musicians, but also these entrepreneurs that are trying to use markets to solve social and environmental problems. So we have been organizing this festival for 2 years. Again, more than 70,000 people on public parks and streets, listening to really nice bands, but also listening to really nice speakers. So we have some pictures there of what has been happening down in South America, and that's another way, more holistic, to engage people from different sectors. And this is a collective creation between, again, universities, the government, business associations, and so on.
Very good. Thank you very much. Are you a B Corp? I need to know.
No, we're not a B Corp, but it sounds very interesting.
When I've heard about this various times from Pippa and Pedro, the question I've always asked myself is, how does this relate to what I think I know a bit about from the UK debate, which is around triple bottom line, shared value, new forms of corporate social responsibility, embedding that in the core of the business, on which there's a lot of work at ODI, among other places, but also Business Fights Poverty. And I think listening to these presentations, there are three things which don't quite correspond to your four headlines, actually. I mean, I think one is around this fiduciary liability and actually embedding it in the bylaws and what you do with that, and how you hold people accountable when there are trade-offs. I think that's very interesting. The second is around the national legislation, where it's possible, which embeds triple bottom line type principles into what all companies do. And the third is this idea of building the movement, although we see that a lot in, I don't know, fair trade, with the big FT and the small FT. Some of the other issues around the certification and standards we're extremely familiar with from Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade, which all have social, environmental and economic standards. But I think this thing of the real value added here seems to me, but I'd like to hear what other people think, around the fiduciary liability, around the legislation, around the community. And we might think about what opportunities arise there, but also what problems might arise. We have good time for discussion. The rules of engagement, I need to explain to you, because maybe this is the first time you've been to one of these meetings, is that we ask people to say who they are, not to ask questions if possible, but to say something interesting which contributes to the conversation, to say it as quickly as you possibly can, and then to stop talking and sit down so that we can have a conversation. So this is not a sort of formal Q&A, but I want to try and open up and really tackle some of these kind of dilemmas that we might be confronting. And people outside the room, if you want to email us or whatever it is you have to do, then I will get them on the iPad. You're first.